hopefully other people appreciate it.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We are going to get started in a few seconds. Please have a seat and get prepared for the great talk that we have today. All right, let's just give a moment. I do recognize some faces. Some of them are my own students, so welcome. I'm Julia Lee. I'm an assistant professor of management and organizations here at the Ross School of Business. And please allow me to introduce the Center for Positive Organizations for those of you who haven't been here before. So we are a community of students, of practitioners, and of faculty who are trying to push the frontier to understand what cultivates flourishing and thriving in individuals and organizations. So that's what we do. But before we start, let me ask you a quick question. How many of you are attending this Positive Link series for the very first time? Please raise your hand. Wow, it's almost like the majority of you. It sounds like David brought all these newcomers to the series. And so welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope that you make a habit of showing up every month. So the purpose of Positive Link series is to invite scholars who do cutting-edge research in this area to translate some of their research into practice. So thank you for being with us today, and I hope you continue to come to this wonderful series in the future. And before I introduce our wonderful speaker, I would also like to acknowledge the generous support from our sponsors. So first of all, Diane and Paul Johns have been generously sponsoring this speaker series since its very beginning, and that involves coming here every month, driving an hour and a half, right? And so thank you so much for your commitment and your effort in making it happen every month. Please give them a round of applause. Thank you so much. And in addition, I would like to thank University of Michigan Organizational Learning, Sanger Leadership Center, Tabor Institute for Global Operations, Zellery Institute for Entrepreneurial Studies, and Lisa and David Drews. So now it is my great pleasure, it's also my great honor and privilege to introduce Dr. David Sherman. Dr. Sherman is the professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at UC Santa Barbara. He received his PhD in psychology from Stanford and completed a postdoc fellowship at UCLA. Dr. Sherman is a widely respected scholar for his work on self-affirmation in psychological science, especially on how people respond to information and events that threaten the self. And all of us can probably remember the last time we were threatened, right? So as a researcher who's been following his work very closely, I admire his work so much that I jumped at the opportunity to bring him here at University of Michigan. And his work is deeply inspiring for many reasons, but I particularly appreciate the fact that much of his research has direct implications for how we go through our lives. And so today, he will share his insights on how self-affirmation can reduce conflict, stress, and underperformance. So please join me, welcome Dr. David Sherman.
Well, thank you for that warm introduction, and thank you for inviting me to the University of Michigan. This is a special place that, for me, in a lot of ways, and I know for everyone here, as a social psychologist, University of Michigan is basically famous and foundational for the contributions of the psychology department and the social psychologists. People like Robert Zients and Richard Nisbet, Hazel Marcus, and Phoebe Ellsworth. They've been foundational in how I think about psychology and social problems. The scholars who I learned from were trained and did research at University of Michigan. It also is great to be here kind of on a personal level. I have my undergraduate advisor is a faculty member here, so someone who I learned from in the East Coast is now here in Michigan. An undergraduate advisee of mine on the West Coast is now here as a PhD student. And so it's wonderful to be here and see kind of all these intellectual influences in my career. and get to be a part of this wonderful speaker series. So thank you. What I've been interested in my research is how people cope with information or events that threaten how they see themselves in some way. So you could be giving a talk at work, giving a speech to your colleagues, and you know that they're evaluating you and that your work can be on the line with how you're talking to them and their responsiveness, and you need to exhibit the leadership of the position that you're holding. Threats to the self can come in organizational contexts. They could come in our social environments. So if you're a student in an academic setting and you're aware that you could be evaluated as a member of a stereotyped group, this can lead to stress or underperformance, what's been termed stereotype threat, and can threaten how you see yourself because you really care about how you perform in this domain. Threats to the self can also happen in the context of intergroup conflict or when people have to negotiate and they might have to give up something that is important to them, something that's tied to a closely held value in order to achieve something that's beneficial for everyone. So how do people cope with these types of information or events that threaten how they see themselves? With my colleagues, we've developed this model of the psychology of self-affirmation. And it starts with the basic premise that people are motivated to possess self-integrity. That is a view of themselves as being capable, moral, and adaptive. So when you see that big self in the middle there, that represents our working self concept. And the different lines are linked to the different domains in our life which are important, our identities, our roles, linked to work, to our political beliefs, our ideologies, our roles such as being a family member. And the goal is to maintain an image of ourselves overall as having integrity, that is, being capable, moral, and adaptive. It's not a model of self-enhancement, that I'm better than everyone else, but rather that I'm good enough in these important domains. When people experience a threat to the self in one of these domains, they tend to become very myopic and focused and vigilant on that threat. They tend to focus on what the implications is of this threat for their overall self-integrity because that node is so connected to the self. And consequently, people can respond defensively by protecting the self. So if you get negative feedback at work, you might initially shun that feedback or say that the person providing the feedback didn't fairly adjudicate my performance. If you get health information suggesting that you need to exercise more, that you're putting yourself at risk with your behaviors, you might be a little bit defensive or deny that information. In fact, a lot of work in health and social psychology shows how people are resistant to self-threatening health information. And the reason people are defensive and resistant, we argue, is because this is a domain that's tightly connected to how they see themselves. Well, the implication of the self-affirmation model is that there's great flexibility in how we respond to threats to the self. We often respond to threats in one part of our lives by affirming the self in another part of our lives. So you have a difficult day at work, and you come home and you play with your children. You affirm this other core part of yourself. Okay? You get difficult information, you get some reviews on a paper that you don't want to see, and you initially might feel defensive, but then you take a moment and you affirm yourself in some other component of your life. You call a friend, you go to the gym, and you work out. So what happens when people engage in this process of self-affirmation? What we find is that reminders of their overall self-integrity, getting a chance to reflect upon these important domains in some other part of life, reduce the need to respond defensively in the focal or threatened domain. And so there's really two big implications of this model that we explore in our research. The first is that these affirmations can serve a stress buffering process. Okay? So these self-affirmations can reassure us that we have integrity, that we're good people, that we're capable and adaptive in other important domains when we're experiencing stress. And this can reduce the physiological costs of the stressor and can potentially turn a threatening situation into a challenging one. And to the extent that stress or concern about negative self-evaluation is impinging or hurting our performance, these reminders of self-integrity can reduce stress and improve our performances in these important life domains. So the first route to affirmation-induced change is through this stress buffering process. The second is through the defensiveness reducing process. So when you're reminded of self-integrity, it reduces the need to engage in otherwise self-protective or defensive behaviors. Okay? The reliance on needing to protect yourself for every possible threat is diminished when you're affirmed, and instead you could be more open to otherwise threatening information. So I'm going to explore the implications of these two routes to change in the research that myself and others have been conducting. All right, now I've been talking about affirmations, and so you might have something in mind, and maybe when you saw a talk, something may have triggered, that affirmations are someone's looking into the mirror and saying, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me, as in the Stuart Smalley character played by Al Franken. These are not what the affirmations look like in the research context that myself and my colleagues have been engaged in. So we'll say goodbye to him. Instead, what the experimental affirmations look like often get people to write about and reflect upon important aspects of their own identities. So here's a prompt that we've developed and that we've given to middle school children, but we've adapted this and used it also for adults in all different age groups. With the adults, we don't usually include the clip art to illustrate the values. Imagine you are a 7th grade student, though. Put yourself back in that mindset, okay? And your teacher comes into class and says, today we're going to engage in a writing task, a writing activity, and passes out envelopes, and you see something like this. And it asks you, what are your personal values? In this assignment, we want to find out about you and have you tell us about who you are and what's important to you. And there's no right or wrong answers. We just want to find out more about you. So please read through this list of values and circle 2 or 3 that are most important to you. Things like athletic ability, being good at art, independence, membership in a social group, relationships with friends and family. So you circle 2 or 3, and then you're given the next page, and you say, look at those values that are most important to you. Okay? Think about these times when these values were particularly important. And take a moment to express why those values are important to you. What were the thoughts and feelings that occurred to you when these values were particularly important to you, or when these things were really important to you? Okay? So just take a moment and think about how you might respond to this prompt. What is most important to you? What are the values that have helped you in difficult times? And what were the thoughts and feelings you had when you were experiencing those? Okay? In our studies, students write about these things for 10 or 15 minutes, and then they turn them back into their teachers. Here's some examples. A middle school participant said, dance is important to me. It's my passion, my life. My second home is the dance studio. My second family is the dance team. My family and friends are so important to me, even more than dance. My family, I can't live without them. Okay? A college student, how can one get by without friendship or family? I know I couldn't. I need that support. At times, it feels like the only thing I have that's real. And then in both these cases, they describe examples from their life that reify and demonstrate the importance of this value. Okay? So what do we think is going on? Well, that's what I'll try to address with the talk and the research today, but a few preliminary things. What this is doing is it's making salient the self-resources that a person has drawn on in the past. Okay, so you're a student, you're not really thinking about dance team, you're not really thinking about your parents and how they've been there for you ordinarily, but it's activating that part of the self-concept in the moment in this classroom and getting you to reflect for 10 or 15 minutes upon the importance of this value to you. It's also important to note that the content is self-generated. The people are writing this themselves. And the exercise is tailored to tap into each person's valued identities, roles, aspects of the self. So it's not me telling you that you have this trait or that you have this or this is important to you. It's you telling yourself that this is important to me and why. And among the many things that we think is going on and that studies have shown is that it seems to provide a bit of a psychological timeout. Okay? How often do we take a time out to kind of take stock of who we are and what's most important to us in the ongoing rush of work or school? It provides students with this psychological timeout to pull out and gain a broader perspective. Okay? All right. So in my talk today, I'm going to try to do three things. First, provide an overview of self-affirmation theory. I've already been doing that for the past 10 minutes or so. And present work in stress, education, and intergroup conflict that's been conducted, kind of inspired and to test hypotheses generated from this theory. Second, I'd like to illustrate how self-affirmation theory has moved from the laboratory, where a lot of this work has been conducted over the years, and I spend a lot of my time and do spend a lot of my time doing laboratory-based experiments, to the field, to shed light both on the theory and the application to business and organizations. And third, I'd like to share some of what we've learned about the mechanisms of affirmation effects across different levels of analysis. I think that understanding the process and the principles is as important as understanding the findings, because it's those process and principles that can be exported and extended into other domains of life and research. Okay, so beginning with the stress research, this figure here presents a person giving a speech in front of an audience. This is a common occurrence in life. It's often people's biggest fear is public speaking. Jerry Seinfeld tells the joke that the number one fear is public speaking, the number two fear is death. So that suggests that people would rather be the eulogized than the eulogizer if they have the choice. So we often use this in our experimental paradigms. And there's been a very reliable procedure that's been developed over the year called the Trier social stress paradigm, where people come into the lab and they give a speech in front of a hostile or indifferent audience. And they also have to do a very difficult math challenge task where you have to count backwards from 2013 by 17s in front of this indifferent audience that corrects you when you get one wrong. Okay, this has been noted to increase individuals' cortisol levels, or stress hormone of cortisol. In this project, which was led by David Creswell, who was a graduate student at UCLA, and I was a postdoc when he was doing this work, and he's now a professor at Carnegie Mellon University, we had people engage in value-affirming activities prior to doing this Trier social stress paradigm, where they had to give a speech and do this counting backwards task. Here's a snapshot of the findings. What you could see is that in baseline, there was no difference between the value affirmation condition and the control condition. I should take a moment to just talk about the control conditions. Control conditions we try to have people do as analogous activities as in the value affirmation condition, often writing about values too, or indicating the importance of values, but non-self-relevant values. We often have them write about why they might be important to someone else, or complete an analogous values ranking activity, but just for a value that is not particularly important. Okay? So in this study, you could see that in the baseline, there was no difference in their cortisol levels. In the control condition, you see the standard spike. Their cortisol went up when they had to do this stressful task, and it maintained for the duration for 45 minutes after the onset. The affirmation attenuated this increase in stress. The people were able to go through the performance, and they exhibited no difference in their actual performance level when we looked at it. But it was less subjectively and physiologically stressful. The next thing that we wanted to do was to move from these acute stressful events, like having to give a speech, to more chronic naturalistic stressors. Studying for exams is an example that's very salient to students and very salient in the academic setting. And indeed, research by Janice Kiko-Glaser and her colleagues and others shows that the stress related to exams, having to study for multiple exams over a period of time, can have downstream health consequences in the form of immune system dysfunction or dysregulation. So we want to see if tapping into these affirmation processes when students are engaging in stressful exams could lead to a reduction in the physiological stress response. This was a paper that we worked on with a team at UC Santa Barbara, along with David Creswell and Lisa Jaremka, who's now a professor at University of Delaware. And what we did in this study was we asked students, what is the exam that you are most stressed out about this quarter, this academic quarter? Okay? We had a big meeting kind of in a room like this where I went through the study procedure. I said, okay, what is the date of that exam? That will be the post-test. Okay? That will be the key date that we're going to build this whole month-long study around. It was 15 days. So every student had their idiosyncratic exam that they were most stressed about. And then we assessed, had them collect their urine for 15 hours prior to that stressful exam. Okay? And then we sent this to the Mayo Clinic to assess their epinephrine and norepinephrine levels. These are catecholamines, which are indicative of sympathetic nervous system activation for stress. So here it is a chronic stressor, the chronic activation of getting kind of worked up about this big exam that you have, and you need to study for it and you need to prepare for it. That's coming up in a couple of weeks. Okay? So we had them do this both on the day before the midterm exam and 15 days before. And then in the 2-week period in between those assessments, we emailed them affirmation activities. During a pretest, they indicated what their most important values were. And those in the affirmation condition, on day 3 and day 10, we gave them their first and second most important values and asked them to reflect upon them, write why they're important in times in their life when they were particularly important. Control participants engage in analogous activity about relatively unimportant values. Okay, so here's what we found. Looking at the epinephrine levels, and we found similar findings for norepinephrine. We see that in the no affirmation condition, from baseline, pretest, to post-test, the day that they were really stressed out about this exam, they showed an increase in epinephrine levels. But for those in the self-affirmation condition, there was no difference. Okay? They were able to cope with this stressor without it being as physiologically taxing, without winding up their sympathetic nervous system to the same extent. Okay? Now, one way that we can dive deeper into the process of what might be going on is to try to see for whom we would expect these effects to be particularly pronounced. We think that those who are most psychologically vulnerable to a particular stressor are the ones who are going to be both most threatened and aroused in the control condition, and the ones who are most affirmed in the affirmation condition. So we gave a measure in pretest of concerns about negative evaluation in college. In college, I worry that people think I'm unintelligent if I do poorly. In college, I worry that people will dislike me. Okay, so all participants completed this measure, which we thought would be a measure of psychological vulnerability. For these people, this big exam might be particularly psychologically stressful. Okay, along the y-axis here is the post-test epinephrine. Now we're controlling for pre-test epinephrine. Over here, for participants with low college concerns, we see that there wasn't much activation in the post-test, and there was no effect of the affirmation. In fact, there seemed like there was no big stressor for them to reduce. Looking here at the no affirmation participants, we see that there was a big increase, a large increase in their epinephrine levels. Okay? These were the ones who were most concerned about negative valuation. They showed the most pronounced activation of their sympathetic nervous system. But the affirmation buffered them the most. When people experienced this greatest psychological vulnerability, they were most benefited by the affirmation. And this is something that we see again and again. Those for whom the threat is particularly salient are the ones who are most buffered by the manipulation. Okay, some organizational implications of this. I think that these two books, one of which I read when it came out by Dan Cable, a collaborator at London Business School, the other by folks who I just met today, provide some examples of how this affirmation process can be used in organizational settings. And I think one of the nicest examples I've seen in how it can be transported is in the context of a study that was done that Dan Cable talks about in his book, where they went to an onboarding of at a call center in India. And they had people engage in something not exactly what we did, but it certainly seems to be an affirming process. New employees, when they came in, they wrote about either their best selves, okay, the times when they were at their best, their pride in the organization, or they went through a standard skills training exercise. And what they found was that the best selves condition improved the employee retention by 32%. And not only were the employees more likely to stay in their workplace, which is a big deal at a call center where there's a lot of turnover, their customers reported a much higher satisfaction in the performance of these employees. So I think these ideas, these principles of providing moments of affirmation during key stressful and transition times have broad organizational implications. Okay. Shifting to the second domain, I'd like to talk about studies that we've conducted in educational settings. And in particular, we've focused on contexts that have demonstrated educational achievement gaps between members of underrepresented minorities and majority students. And before I dive into this research, I just want to say that there are many causes for these educational achievement gaps beyond psychological factors. You know, they're multiply determined and they're important social and societal issue that has brought together scholars from education, sociology, and other fields. So we think psychology plays some role, but it is not to say that psychology is determinative or accounts for the entirety of educational achievement gaps. There's been a number of studies that have been conducted that have used self-affirmation manipulations, self-affirmation experiments in field settings in schools from a wide range of academic situations. The original studies were done by my collaborator, Jeffrey Cohen and Julio Garcia, and their team in the Northeast. And they went to schools that were mixed-race middle schools, predominantly African-American and white in the schools. Just as I described earlier, they had teachers give these affirmation exercises to the students a number of times during the school year. The studies were double-blind so that the teachers didn't know what condition the students were in, and the students didn't know that they were even in the context of this experiment. They didn't know what condition they were in relative to what other students were receiving. And then they followed them and looked at their academic performance. And they found initially in 2006 that it reduced the achievement gap looking at GPA at the end of the semester. They followed this and ran additional cohort and found that the effects were pronounced and lasted for 2 years, the length of middle school from the initial affirmations that were going through in the 7th grade year. This study, this paradigm has been extended and replicated across a number of different settings. Most recently, Jeffrey Borman and his team at the University of Wisconsin, they conducted a study where they ramped up the study and did it in 11 schools in Wisconsin and found overall that the effects persisted, but it was in some domains, some schools more so than others. The schools where they thought, where the context was more threatening, showed the most pronounced effects. This has also been used in college settings. Kira Miyake has looked at this in terms of women in physics classrooms, where they did an intervention using the values affirmation for male and female physics students, showing that it boosted the performance of the female physics students. And Judy Harakevich and her team at the University of Wisconsin-Madison looked at it in terms of first generation versus continuing education biology students. Okay? So in all of these cases, and there have been other studies I'm happy to chat about too that have found null or mixed effects, and one of the interesting things that we're all studying is when are you more likely to get these effects and when are you less, and we're learning from the process as we go on. But in all of these studies, educational achievement gaps were attenuated. And we think that this is because it helps reduce the stress that might be accompanied being a member of a minority or underrepresented group in those particular contexts. In our studies, we examined this in mixed ethnicity middle schools that were predominantly white and Latino American samples. In this first study that we published in this 2013 paper, the school body was predominantly low income. 90% of the Latino American students were receiving meal assistance. And we conducted the study with the entire school, the 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. Okay. Consent forms went to the students. They had to complete them with they and their parents. We gave them a description of the study and they completed it. And so that led us to have a final sample in the study of 184 students. During the school year, they completed 4 to 5 affirmation versus control activities. Okay? So we randomly assigned them, maintained the condition assignment for all the exercises that they did, and they did variants of the activity. We kept it fresh by modifying the values or looking at or the instructions, but the core was the same thing as I showed you earlier. And the DV, the outcome there, was GPA, core course GPA for a 3-year period. We were able to monitor the students' grades via their transcripts for 3 years. Okay, so here's the findings. Along the y-axis is GPA on a 4-point scale. Okay, and you could see the 4 different groups, the white students who are either in the affirmation or control condition, and the Latino students who are either in the affirmation or control condition. Okay, so pre-intervention. Okay, this is prior to intervention. This is the previous year grades. You can see the large achievement gap between the 2 groups. Okay, but you can see that there was no difference in conditions. Those 2 dots were right on top of each other. Over time, however, we see that there is a downward trajectory among the Latino students in the control condition. So in yellow, you could see that there's this negative slope. As the school year progressed, their grades declined. But this trajectory was deflected among those Latino students who completed the value affirmation or the self-affirmation activities, such that there was about a 0.3 GPA difference by the end of the year in these 2 groups. We continue to monitor the students in the study and collect data on their grades to see whether it might persist when they entered into a new environment. That is, we looked at them over 3 years, and so you have the 8th graders who will eventually go to high school. Okay? So here is in year 1 of the study. This is just a combined picture of what the results looked like that I just showed you quarter by quarter. You could see that the educational achievement gap was attenuated in the affirmation condition. And it persisted into year 2, where 1/3 of the students were now high school students. And somewhat weaker, but into year 3, when 2/3 of the students were now in high school. Okay, so you might be asking yourself, how does this occur? How can these activities, these relatively simple and straightforward writing activities, lead to this long-term pronounced change? Well, it's not that the affirmation magically sticks to the students and they're just then superstar students, who can then persist in all the different environments. It isn't that there's something that that fundamentally sticks to them and persists over time. That's not really the way we think about it or the way we think is correct to think about it. What we think is going on is that affirmation can lead to lasting change, and any intervention can lead to lasting change if it triggers a cycle of adaptive potential, that's our terminology, for a positive feedback loop between the self system and the social system that persists over time, or that promotes adaptive outcomes over time. Okay, so check out this figure. Self-system here represents something that could be affected by the affirmation. You write an activity. Okay, you feel this broader perspective and this greater self-resources. It reduces your stress, and it could lead to a better performance on a quiz or a test that you have subsequently. Performing better then serves as an affirmation of the self. It feeds back to the self. You're seeing yourself a little bit differently because you performed a little bit better. Okay? So now you may have two sources of affirmation you could think of, that initial experience perhaps, and then performing better on the test. Okay? This then feeds back into the social system. So if you do better, now a teacher might recognize you in a different way. They might give you a little more positive reinforcement. Okay? They might provide more challenging material because you've performed better over time. And this more positive or challenging material then could lead directly to more adaptive outcomes. You could then do better on the test. This could also feed back to the self so that you have another source of affirmation. Your teacher is perhaps treating you somewhat differently because you performed better or in a different context. And through these recursive processes, we think that the incidents that happen in our lives can lead to lasting change when they interact with ongoing forces in the environment. Okay? One of the principles behind this cycle of adaptive potential is one of the oldest ideas in social psychology, the idea of subjective construal. That what matters less in some cases, or as much in some cases, is not the objective situation that people are experiencing, but their subjective construal of it. And the lesson of this intervention work, or the suggestion of this intervention work, is that even if the objective situation doesn't change, the subjective construal of that situation could change over time. And it may be that that subjective construal is what's carrying people over time. That's what could be affecting things over the longer term. Okay? Well, this is abstract. Can we bring this and test this and provide evidence for these ideas of subjective construal to understand the long-term effects of academic performance? We sought to do this in a second study in that paper. This was a smaller scale version. We had a smaller sample of a mixed ethnicity middle school. They completed 2 value affirmations or control activities during the year. What was key to this study, what was the key addition to this study, was that in their health class, we went between 4 to 6 times during the school year to get them to complete daily surveys about their experience that day, to try to cap the subjective construal of what is going on for those students in the course of the school year. All right, this is a timeline of the study. You're not really supposed to be able to see all those times, but though each line there represents a different time that we visited the school system. We really felt as though we were embedded in this school and really got to know them very well. And this was a very collaborative effort, and this type of work requires a big team. And here's a picture of me and my collaborators who worked on this project, Valerie Purdy Greenaway, Jeff Cohen, Kevin Binning, Julio Garcia, and Kim Hartson, some of the researchers who worked together with me on this big project. Okay, so the first question is, would we observe a similar pattern in findings of the performance on grades as a function of the affirmation? Here's the results. Again, GPA along the y-axis. Here we didn't have a pretest measure, so the affirmation occurred before the first academic quarter, and we see a similar pattern. The Latino students in the control condition show this downward trajectory, and the affirmation seems to deflect the trajectory, such that the educational achievement gap between the white students and Latino students is attenuated. Pictured differently, here's the average GPA of the first semester and second semester, the academic performance. Okay. The other thing we want to try to get at this study was their daily experience of ongoing stressors for the students. So we created this questionnaire where up to 6 times during the school year, students would be asked to report, how are you feeling today? And we created measures to assess daily adversity. Today, I feel nervous about school. Today, I feel stressed out about school. We want to tap into something akin to racial or identity threat. So today in school, I'm worried that other people might judge me based on my race. Today in school, I'm worried that people will judge my race because of the way other kids in my group behave. Okay? How concerned were they about this today? And then we want to assess how they were feeling about school. Okay? So do you feel as though you, you belong in school? Today I really felt as though I belonged in school. Today I felt efficacious. I could do well. I can succeed in school. Today I had a lot of pride in my school. Okay? All those 3 subfactors hung together for our measure of school feelings. Okay? So we gave the participants this questionnaire multiple times, and this enabled us to get at some of these questions about their ongoing experience or subjective construal of their ongoing experience at school. Okay, so is adversity, the stress, encoded as identity threat? Okay, that's a different story. If you're experiencing stressors but you're viewing them through the lens of your group, that's a different experience, and that might help explain why we see the beneficial effects for the Latino students and no effects for the white students. Okay, so along the y-axis here is the within-person correlation between their assessment of daily adversity, those stress measures, and those identity threat measures. And it basically says how much do these 2 things correlate with each other. Okay? For the white participants, the correlation was very close to 0. Okay, so that means that on days when they're highly stressed or on days when they're not very stressed, they're not linking it to identity threat. Okay? Those 2 factors are not connected in their mind, and affirmation has no effect. For the Latino American students in the control condition, we see a strong positive correlation. Okay? So on days when they are experiencing a lot of adversity, they are also encoding it, or it's linked, they're also experiencing identity threat. They're concerned about the negative implications for their group. Now this is only correlation, it isn't causal, so it could be the other way around. On days when they are feeling as though they're being judged as a member of their racial group, they may be experiencing a lot of stress, but those 2 variables hung together. We think that tells us something about how they're subjectively construing their ongoing experience over time. In the affirmation condition, though, these 2 variables were decoupled. Okay? It didn't affect the mean level of stress or identity threat, but just the meaning that it possessed for them. Similarly, we could look, does identity threat relate to how they feel their school feelings, what we call a measure of academic fit? Do they feel like they belong, have efficacy, have pride in their school? Okay, again, along the y-axis is the correlation between these 2 variables, the identity threat variable and the school feelings variable. For the white students, there was not much of a correlation and there was no difference between conditions. But for Latino American students in the control condition, we see a strong negative relationship. Okay? On days when they feel a lot of identity threat, they feel as though they don't belong in school. Okay? They feel less efficacious in pride. In the affirmation condition, we see no correlation between them. Okay? And so we take this as evidence, and there have been other studies that have used this similar type of methodology to indicate something about the subjective experience of being a student in these studies, in these school settings. And this is over a period of months within the 7th grade school year. And so what we think could persist is how people are perceiving the events that are occurring in their environment. Okay, this has been extended, as I mentioned before, into looking at college performance. And it's also been extended into the performance of MBA students. So I want to just share one study by Zoe Kinneas, who's a professor at INSEAD, and she extended and developed affirmations to give to MBA students in INSEAD in Singapore to see whether or not the achievement gap between men and women that they were observing in MBA performance that was driven in part by stereotype threat could be attenuated through the process of affirmation. And that's exactly what they found. So they found that the female participants or the female MBA students performed better when they were given the chance to affirm their individual values. Interestingly, they included another condition where they affirmed kind of more organizational values or values that are central to the school, and that did not show the boost in performance. Instead, it was writing about what was most important to them and why it was important to them. Okay. The third domain that I'd like to finish up with is talking about some of the work that we've been doing in terms of intergroup conflict and negotiation. Okay. Last year, with two of my students, Jacob Brookfield and Lauren Artusky, we wrote this review paper looking at barriers to common ground in intergroup conflict and taking a self-affirmation perspective. And we reviewed a lot of the literature that's been done in negotiation and in intergroup conflict that has used the affirmation approach. The logic tying these studies together is that because our social identities are really tightly linked to how we see ourselves, we'll be resistant to information that contradicts those social identities. But an opportunity to affirm some other part of our lives should make us less defensive about protecting those social identities and more open to otherwise threatening information. Here are a few examples of different domains where this has been observed. In one study, which I did along with Hee-Jung Kim, who's at University of California, Santa Barbara, we looked at the attributions that people made for success and failure in a group context. We did this in the context of intramural sports. So we went to intramural basketball games, and we asked participants before the game if they would participate in the study immediately after, and they were all happy to do so in order to get the $5 gift that we were giving them. They came to participate in the study, and we separated the two teams, the winning team and the losing team. We gave them values affirmation exercises or control exercises, and then we asked them, what happened? Why did your team win or lose the game? To what extent did these different factors contribute to the outcome of the game? In the control condition, we saw a clear group serving bias. When the teams won, it's because we played great, but when the team lost, it was not because we played poorly. So you see a big gap in the importance of the team's performance and the team's teamwork. And this was attenuated in the affirmation condition, such that there was no difference between the winning teams and the losing teams. The winning teams were more open to say that, or were more open to the idea that our play wasn't the entire factor in us winning, and the losing teams were less likely to say that no, or were more willing to take responsibility for their team's defeat. We've also conducted studies in the context of negotiation. In one study, participants role-played a negotiation where they represented someone who was on one side of the pro-choice, pro-life debate. Okay, and they need to negotiate and come to common ground with someone who opposed them in crafting a state policy on abortion. The way we set up the context was that if you failed to come to an agreement, all the students in the study were pro-choice. If you failed to come to an agreement, it would go to another committee that would be much more restrictive in their policies based on their beliefs, the composition of the committee. Okay? So you're in a situation here where you really want to defend your beliefs, but if you compromise, then it will lead to a better overall outcome. Okay? Those in the affirm condition were more open to the other side and were more willing to make concessions in this context. And then other work looking specifically at intergroup conflict conducted by a team of European researchers found that when those who were thinking about intergroup conflict between Israelis and Palestinians or between Bosnian Serbs and Croats, they were more willing to acknowledge responsibility for their group's role in the conflict, and they indicated greater support for reparative measures. Okay. With my collaborator, Konstantina Badea, and our team, we were interested in seeing if this openness to otherwise identity-threatening information might be playing some role in anti-immigrant sentiment that she was observing in France. She's a professor at Paris Nanterre in France. And so this is a picture of Marie Le Pen and a kind of nationalistic response to the perceived threat of terrorism and immigrants ongoing in France. We had over 200 participants across 2 studies, which I'll combine here. They completed either values self-affirmation activities in French. We pre-tested what would be important values in the French context. Or they completed group affirmation activities, and we had different group affirmation activities. They wrote about why this might be important to students at your school, why this might be important to French students, or control activities. And then the outcomes in the study was the extent to which they expressed anti-immigrant sentiment. And we were interested in what might be driving this effect. Is it that immigrants are seen as less threatening to you, both in terms of the symbolism, that they will negatively affect the French way of life, that would be a symbolic threat, or in terms of their actual threat, that they will take jobs away from native French participants or people. Okay, the group affirmation activity was no different than the control condition, so we put those 2 together. And we found that the self-affirmation relative to those other 2 conditions led to reduced prejudice against immigrants in this setting. And it was associated with both a reduction in the extent to which immigrants were seen as a realistic and a symbolic threat to the French way of life. And this mediated or accounted for the difference in conditions. Okay, so to wrap up, across these different domains in stress, education, and intergroup conflict, we found that affirming the self can give people a broader perspective on the threatening events that they are seeing in their lives. And I think one implication of this is that organizations can incorporate, and to the extent they can incorporate more or particularly well-timed value-affirming activities in the workplace. A lot of the studies that we've done in terms of field studies have been timed to be in terms of key transitions. We picked 7th grade because it's a key transition from elementary school in the context where the studies were to middle school. Okay, the students are forming their identities in this new situation. They're telling new stories about themselves to themselves. Similarly, for people who are just transitioning into a new job, that's a moment where this type of approach could potentially change their subjective construal as they're experiencing new information. I focused a lot on what we think is going on in terms of underlying mechanism from different levels of analysis. And I think that that is one of the key take-home points. It's not the intervention experimental procedure per se, but the procedures, but the process and the principles. The idea that how we make meaning of our ongoing situation is malleable. And even if the objective situation is the same, thinking about what's important to us in key moments can change the perspective that we're bringing to events and change the way they impact us and have these cascading effects. And that brings me to the third point, is that I want to kind of reiterate that affirmations shouldn't be seen as the cause here. Okay? They were the things that we manipulated, the element that we manipulated, but what caused the performance was the student's efforts and ability to take advantage of the educational opportunities that the teacher was offering. Okay? These don't happen in a vacuum, and it's better to think of these affirmations or any type of intervention not as the cause per se, but as something that could potentially trigger this cycle of adaptive potential, that could act as a catalyst, that could unleash the forces that are in the environment that could propel people to more adaptive outcomes. With that, I'd like to thank you all, thank my collaborators, and thank the Center for Positive Organizations. There's Rosa the tortoise, who's a mascot of the organization, and thank you all for your attention.
All right, thank you so much for your wonderful talk, David. On behalf of the Center for Positive Organizations, I have a small token of appreciation. So it's our valued tradition to give our speaker an artifact. It's a positive spiral. So there you go.
Well, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Such a privilege to have you come visit us here and interact with our group, and so feel free to stay around and ask him your questions. I'm sure a lot of you have burning questions about his research, so thank you so much for being here today. And I also invite you to join us next month. Professor Daniel McAdams from Northwestern University is scheduled to speak on the topic of authoring a good life in America, narrative identity and redemptive life stories. And so we have another set of speakers next month and then in December. So please join us as this great speaker series continues. And again, thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great night. Thank you, David, for the wonderful talk. Thank you.